This is the story of how a little one-eyed goofball went on to risk the lives of all humanity, nearly killing Mark Grayson. At the end of season 1 of Invincible, we get a glimpse at one of the strongest characters in the series. We're talking about the true Giga Chad of Invincible, the one who makes Omniman look like a total joke, Alan the Alien. But he wasn't always the most powerful around. So to fully understand this outstanding orange alien, we need to understand his origins. Like the Viltrumites, another major alien race in Invincible is the Unopans. And there is no Unopan more important than Alan. During the Viltrumite expansion efforts, they would attack and wipe out any planet brave or foolish enough to fight against them. In issue 23, Alan thinks back on the history of his people and tells us that the Viltrumites invaded like a plague and conquered the planet in a matter of days. We talked about the Viltrumites in our video on Nolan, which if you haven't seen, definitely check out. But if you watched that video, then you'd notice a lot of parallels between the stories of the Viltrumites and the Unopans. The word plague being chosen to describe their invasion is no accident. And like the Viltrumites after their own plague, there were very few Unopans left. In a way, this marked them as a parallel species, one working towards conquest and the other towards peace and progress. Now, just like the Viltrumites, they were pushed to near extinction. The Unopans would cling to life. They abandoned their planet and set up breeding camps so that they might bring their people back from the brink. These camps were basically factories. The goal was to raise as many children as possible, as fast as possible. And because of this, the idea of family and social behavior were just completely left behind. Over time, the Unopans' story of survival would spread and impress Theodus, the leader of the coalition of planets and a rogue Viltrumite. Due to this, they were invited to join, and this is where Alan's story takes another dark twist. The Unopans approached the council with a possible way to fight back against the Viltrumites. They believed that with enough genetic enhancement and eugenics, they could produce the ultimate Unopan. And because the coalition were all terrified of the Viltrumites, this plan was approved immediately. This had questionable results to say the least. It would take years of failed live experimentation and disfigured Unopan children until finally a single subject survived. This, of course, was Alan. Alan, much like Emperor Thrag, the ruler of the Viltrumites, was trained from birth so that he could be turned into the perfect living weapon, and seemingly this worked. By the time he was in alien puberty, he'd become a certified beast, and the Unopans could not find any opponent who was even a match for Alan. When he was finally an adult, the coalition felt he was ready for his first real test, fighting Viltrumites. And well, this went terribly. By the end of the fight, he is left bleeding and broken. Turns out the peace-loving coalition were not as talented at training fighters as the war-mongering Viltrumites. I know. Who'd have thought that? With Alan's defeat, the Super Unopan breeding project was considered a failure and shut down forever. But this didn't stop his mission though. Once he recovered, he was sent into space and given the fake title of Champion Evaluation Officer. Basically, he was gonna fly planet to planet and ask to fight their strongest person in hopes of finding someone who might be powerful enough to take on the Viltrumites, ultimately leading him to the far-off planet Urath, where he would ironically come face to face with one of the Viltrumites he was meant to defeat. Here, Alan the Alien would test his might against Omniman. However, at this point in the story, he just wasn't a match for him. Even by the time Mark got his powers, Nolan considered Alan to be only as strong as his son. Having found Nolan and believing him to be a normal Urathling, Alan returned to the coalition of planets with good news of a potential warrior to fight off the Viltrumites. As such, they would send him back every few years to continue testing Nolan. This would continue until he sent Mark to fight it in his place, something which changed the course of Alan's life forever. In issue 5, when he first crossed paths with Mark, he is ready to fight as always, but finds himself being sent hurtling into the moon through a little chit-chat. Alan explains that he was sent to test the champion that guards the planet to ensure they're up to snuff. In spite of this, Mark is clueless, stating that his planet would never sign up for something crazy like this. In spite of this, Alan shows him proof that he was sent to Urath for this mission, which is when Mark breaks the news that Alan has been visiting the wrong planet this entire time. This is Earth. Realizing that he just wasted 15 years testing the wrong planet, Alan shakes Mark's hand, thanks him for his help, and heads back to the Coalition. Yeah, he really fucked up. Now, this is the first time in the story we get a look at who Alan is as a character. Despite taking his position very seriously, he's also kind of this ultimate chill dude. He gives Mark a timeout, he's okay with talking things over, and he is fully willing to accept that he made a mistake. It's something very interesting when you compare him to someone like Omniman, who tends to be more stoic and serious. Finding out that he was at the wrong planet wasn't the only shock that Alan would receive though, as once he made it back to the Coalition, they told him that Earth was off limits because they'd already been claimed by Viltrum. By the time Alan returns to Earth to warn Mark about the Viltrumites in issue 13, it's already too late. Nolan had already given his son the beating of a lifetime. Mark explains everything that had happened to Alan, how his father is a Viltrumite, how he attacked him and wanted to take over Earth, and how he just dipped after their fight. Alan tells Mark how it is super weird for a Viltrumite to just leave their post and all about the history of him and his people. His mission is to fight and kill the Viltrumites. After all, they nearly wiped out his entire race and they left him next to dead 15 years ago. But when Mark apologizes for what Alan has lived through, he explains to the young lad that it isn't his fault. This is an idea I want to hold on to as we continue with Alan's story, because as he is right now, Alan does not believe that all Viltrumites are bad. He sees Mark as an individual and does not hold him accountable for the actions of the rest of his people. He believes that at the very least there is some chance of Viltrumites being good people, and that opens him up to the possibility of some of them might even be able to become better. But as you'll soon see, things are bound to change. Alan goes as far to apologize to Mark for not being there to warn him sooner or realizing that the threat that his father could pose. He personally feels like he should have done more, and it's this sense of duty that he shares with Nolan which signals the start of this intertwining pattern of similarities and contrasting points between the two of them. From this point on, Nolan and Alan do this weird dance with their character writing. When Nolan is in the wrong, Alan is in the right. And when Alan's character is beginning to slip up, Nolan usually finds himself becoming better. This all comes with these interesting moments where their senses of morality are in the exact same point as Nolan is becoming better and Alan is degrading. This allows them to feel more similar than they actually are, and it amplifies the moments where they stand opposed to one another. Now, before leaving, Alan tells Mark that the Coalition will probably want to hear about this good Viltrumite and asks if he'd be willing to fight with them, to which Mark offers to do anything he can to save other planets from the Viltrumite threat. With a new ally ready and waiting, Alan returns home to Talescrian and tells the Council about Nolan abandoning Earth, along with Mark rejecting Viltrum and offering to help the Coalition to fight off the Viltrumites. Theodus suggests that the Viltrumites' mission of breeding on other planets may lead to their downfall, as the offspring raised there might not have the loyalty to the Empire, bringing a sense of hope to everyone. With his report submitted, Alan returns to his half-naked blue girlfriend Telia. Alan's people forbid physical love with other races because their species was pushed to such small numbers in the past. That said, it takes about 30 seconds for her to convince him to take one for the team and get down to business. Now, funnily enough, this actually continues his parallel with Nolan. Almost every time we see Alan and Telia, she wants to smash, and he pushes back immediately before caving. On the other hand, we are constantly being shown that Nolan loves going to Pound Town and will take every opportunity he has to get some. Seriously, respect. Now, once Alan and Telia finish things up, he is attacked by a Viltrumite soldier and pushed into space. Here, they are joined by two more Viltrumites who question Alan about his time on Earth, but more specifically about Nolan abandoning his post. When Alan runs out of information, the Viltrumites completely brutalize him. They knock his eye out, shatter his teeth, break his back, punch through his stomach, and slice his arms right off. So, like, between that and his time with Telia, it was a pretty okay day, I suppose. Luckily, Luckily, the Coalition is able to save him, but he is in rough shape, only being kept alive by what is essentially a full-body cast of machinery. Theodos explains to Alan that he's only to report directly to him going forward, as there is clearly a mole in the Coalition Council feeding intel to the Viltrumites. It would take several months of healing in the stasis pod, but eventually Alan was back to full strength. Actually, a bit better than that. As they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And this new and improved Alan was so much stronger than his old self that he exploded out of the machine he was in just by trying to get up. At this point, Alan is now as invulnerable as Viltrumites, and with training, he could be even stronger than them. Like Mark, Theodos rebelled against the Viltrumite Empire, and because he believes having Mark on their side will be massively important, he sends Alan back to Earth as soon as possible to fetch him. Things go a little differently this time. When Alan arrives, he is challenged by the Immortal. For reference, this dude is about as close to a real opponent humanity could offer for Nolan. He definitely isn't as strong as a Viltrumite, but he is certainly no pushover. And that's pretty important to note, because after the Immortal punches Alan, the alien realizes that despite being taken completely off guard, he is totally fine and not hurt in the slightest. Luckily, Mark arrives to stop the fight before things escalate much farther. He and Alan return to his dorm, where it's explained to Mark that he is needed in Talescrian so that the Coalition could get things moving in the right direction in their war against the Viltrumites. There was a big problem though. Mark refused, as he had too much on his plate at the moment with dealing with his new alien little brother. He asks Alan if they're going to need to fight over this, but he just tells him not to worry about it because 1. Theodos values him too much for Alan to hurt him, and 2. He thinks Mark is a chill dude, so he doesn't really want to force him into anything. Well, for now at least. Now it's Mark's turn to give Alan an exposition dump. He tells him about his journey to Thraxa, how Nolan had been arrested after fighting against some Viltrumites, and how he had another child that his mother is now raising, who despite being only a few months old was already a teenager and developing his powers. But most importantly, about how Nolan wanted Mark to read the books he had written. These books are an opportunity to turn the tide of the upcoming war, as Nolan documented his journeys across the stars and all the things which managed to put him in a spot of bother. And so with a blueprint to defeating the Viltrumite army and a promise that Mark would join the Coalition forces when it was actually time to fight, Alan flies back off to Talescrian with the hope that they can and will prevail. On the way home, Alan would make a small little detour. As he flies through space, he begins thinking of reuniting with Telia and wonders if he is strong enough to convince his people to allow them to get married. However, he is interrupted by a Viltrumite ship. Anissa, who had just failed to recruit Mark, attacks Alan, lamenting that she'd already tried winning people over with words, and so now she must resort to brute force. This is Alan's first time fighting a Viltrumite since he was ambushed on Talescrian. But this time, he is quite literally built different. When he hits Anissa, she is shocked by how much it hurts, even saying that he hit harder than her ex-husband, which is really a whole other issue. But Viltrumite Bill Cosby over here ain't getting any sympathy from me. Even when she hits Alan, he is completely unharmed. In fact, he uses this as an opportunity. Anissa mentions that she is going to lock him in prison and kill him there personally, since he keeps surviving their on-site executions. Hearing this, Alan shows himself to be taken prisoner by pretending to lose the fight in hopes of finding Nolan and helping him escape. First off, being so confident in yourself to allow yourself to be captured and put in a Viltrumite prison, it's just insane. I'd say it's a death sentence, but I mean, it quite literally is a death sentence. And Alan just goes in smiling. And secondly, it's pretty relevant to mention that when Anissa thinks Alan is knocked out, she considers herself lucky. This idea is reiterated in issue 55 when the narrator explains that Alan's shackles, the walls, and even the prison itself could not hold him, for he has become very strong. And so, if you couldn't tell already, Alan is now a real threat to the Viltrumites, and with the exception of their leader, that's because he is now more powerful than any of them. Thus, it doesn't take long for Alan to cross paths with Nolan in the prison, and the two begin talking telepathically from their cells. Alan brings Nolan up to speed on what's been happening with Mark, the Coalition, and the Viltrumites, informing him that he is there to help him escape. escape. Their bond begins to grow as they evolve from enemies to allies to friends, sitting in the darkness talking about their hopes, dreams, and personal lives. Alan tells Nolan all about the girl he loves and how his people will never allow them to be together, whilst Nolan talks about how his people aren't supposed to feel love, and yet he misses his wife and kids. This issue continues the contrast of these characters' stories, literally showing them mirrored on page 4 as they open up to one another. Of note here is that both of them come from dwindling species with strange perspectives on love. Alan isn't free to be with who he wants because it goes against his people's traditions, whereas Nolan is realizing that he can't be with the one he loves due to how he acted as a loyal Viltrumite. One is caving into the pressure of being the Unopian, while the other is realizing the flaws in Viltrum's mindset. But still, both want to live freely. Just like he had when he first talked to Mark, Alan is experiencing that Viltrumites are capable of change, and that there is some good to them, and that they are not just this monolith of evil conquerors. Now, as Anissa mentioned, Alan was scheduled to be executed in person since he kept recovering after his encounters with Viltrum. However, even here, nothing works. They try crushing his head in a hydraulic press, and the machine just breaks. They shoot a laser at him, and it just bounces off his chest and blows a hole in the wall. And so eventually, it was decided upon that only a Viltrumite could kill him, and so he and Nolan would wait for their executions, and continue to wait a very long period beyond the point Nolan had expected. In spite of this, the time would finally arrive. As Nolan is taken away, Alan breaks free of his shackles and prepares to escape. He flies through the halls of the ship, freeing all the prisoners along the way. This was meant both to cause a distraction, but also in case they found some possible allies to help them in this war. And whilst most of the prisoners are more useless than a screen door on a submarine, he does find Battle Beast, a giant lion man who wishes to fight powerful opponents so that he can die a noble death on the battlefield, which works out pretty well, as when he and Alan find Nolan, he has 2 Viltrumite guards with him. Alan leaves Battle Beast to face one of them, whilst he and Nolan punch a hole out of the ship, launching the other guard into space. The narrator tells us that this was a loyal and powerful Viltrumite soldier who had trained with the best of them, but with just a single punch from both Alan and Nolan, the dude's head completely explodes as his brain is sent flying into the void. I'm sure this is probably being blurred by now, but just trust me, bro. For now, they were safe, as Nolan reveals that the reason he had to wait so long to be executed is because there are less than 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites left alive. Due to them being spread so thin, they can't justify having too many of them in one place. He explains that Viltrum was more or less eliminated at the hands of the Scourge virus, but now that they know about Mark, Nolan fears that the Viltrumites will turn Earth into a breeding camp to revive their species due to the close resemblance and compatibility with their DNA, meaning that suddenly the future of Viltrum looks a lot like the past of Unopian. But for now, all Nolan and Alan can do is head back to Talescria. Upon their return, they meet with Theodus, where Alan vouches for Nolan. Together, they are given the task of collecting all the threats to Viltrum that Nolan had mentioned in his books. Most relevantly, this includes Space Racer and his gun, as well as the dinosaur-like Ragnars. Between all their missions, Alan and Telia make up for lost time loud enough to keep Nolan up for days on end, if you know what I mean. But eventually, all the anti-Viltrum tools are collected, with Alan and Nolan returning to Earth to pick up Mark, Oliver, and for some reason, a dude named Tech Jacket, who is actually a superhero from one of the author's other comic books. Now, if you didn't know that little Easter egg, then make sure you hit the like button and ding that notification bell, as it's more important than ever if you want to keep up with the brand new Invincible content. Now, things were going great for the Coalition. They were ready for war. However, their return flight is attacked by none other than Conquest, Lucan, and a third Viltrumite. Alan and Tech Jacket take on Lucan pretty easily at first, but things change very quickly. Firstly, an army of alien soldiers ruled by the Viltrumites come to support their empire. And secondly, Oliver runs out of oxygen. He needs to get to a nearby planet for air and fast, causing both Conquest and Mark to follow him, with Nolan just behind. Now alone and totally outgunned, Tech Jacket forms a shell on the outside of the Viltrumite ship with his armor that he and Alan can hide inside of until they are somewhat safe. Luckily, Alan's gear has tracking devices in it, so it isn't long until Space space racer accompanied by a small army arrives to save them, with no one knowing the fate of Nolan, Mark and Oliver at this time. Even without them, the Coalition begins making an assault on Viltrumite forces. They manage to successfully take back several stronghold planets using the tools that Nolan and Alan collected. However, the upper hand was swiftly taken away from them with a single command by Emperor Thrag of the Viltrumites: invade Talescria. The battle on the Coalition homeworld was brutal. While Alan and Theodus are holding their own, the rest of their forces were not so lucky. Fortunately, the number of actual Viltrumites was very low, and instead they have conquered races doing most of the fighting. But even so, the Coalition is put on the back foot until help arrives, as Nolan and his sons finally make it to Talescria after a month of being MIA. They quickly crash through the Viltrumite battleship and stop the ground troops, forcing Thrag to call for a temporary retreat. In spite of this, Alan and the Coalition know that it is important to strike whilst the iron's hot. Thus, they chase the fleeing Viltrumites back to their homeworld. What awaits them, however, was an ambush of over 30 Viltrumites. Alan is shown to be a total badass and has very little problem with most of the enemies he comes across. It isn't until planet Viltrum is destroyed, causing the frenzied Viltrumites to gang up on him, that he even begins to take damage. Seeing Alan in danger, Space Racer grabs him and takes him to safety, giving Alan no choice but to reluctantly leave Mark, Nolan and Oliver behind to fight Thrag and his empire, something that goes very poorly as they are only spared due to some absolutely insane levels of plot armor. Unfortunately, the Coalition suffered a major fatality. Their great leader, Theodus, was killed in the battle after destroying Viltrum, where it was ultimately decided that Alan be made the new leader of the Coalition, meaning that he was no longer just Alan the alien, he was the Great Alan. He is charged with eliminating the remaining Viltrumite threat. However, since the battle, they've completely vanished without a trace, much to the delight of the Coalition. Things soon turn south, however, when Mark realizes that the reason they're so quiet is because they'd already invaded Earth to make it their new homeworld. Because of this, he and his father swiftly head back, praying they can make it back before the entire planet has been wiped out. Whilst they're gone, Alan is put under increasing pressure from the Council to eliminate the Viltrumite threat and prove himself worthy, which is when he receives an old letter from Theodus saying that if he was to pass away, he wants Alan to use the improved Scourge virus against the Viltrumites. Before making such a drastic decision, Alan asks Telia if doing something terrible for the benefit of the universe makes him a bad person. She responds saying that he has to make difficult judgments as part of his work, even if it means killing Nolan and his sons. Now, speaking of Nolan, he and Debbie have returned to live on Talescria. Whilst the Viltrumite threat had been squashed due to negotiations between Thrag and Mark, ensuring that they could all live peacefully on Earth, repopulating and rebuilding their empire, Nolan still wasn't welcome there. The problem was, that wasn't the only place he'd feel unwelcome. As upon his return to Talescria, he is met with the news of Alan's plans to release the Scourge virus on Earth, risking not only the lives of his sons, but also all of humanity due to the extremely close resemblance in their DNA structure. This sends Nolan into a complete frenzy. He begs Alan to reconsider, but as a result of the pressure being placed on him, he feels that the sacrifice of Earth might just be a necessary evil in eliminating the greatest threat to the entire universe. This is about the time when Alan reaches the lowest moral point in the series, willing to do absolutely anything and everything in his power to kill the Viltrumites, even if it meant sacrificing an entire planet of people. In many ways, becoming no better than the Viltrumites who attacked his very own homeworld Unopian. Meanwhile, Nolan is at his peak of morality, doing his best to ensure innocent lives aren't lost in a battle that has nothing to do with them. When Alan refuses to listen, Nolan attacks him, but Alan just lets him do his thing as he isn't really doing any damage at this point regardless. It was in this moment that Nolan got a taste of how Mark felt all that time ago, as he saw himself on the end of a brutal beatdown from somebody far stronger than him, leaving him helplessly begging for the safety of those he loved until Oliver arrived to back his father Surprisingly though, once he hears what's happening, Oliver sides with Alan in sacrificing Earth to stop Viltrumites. That was the final nail in the coffin. Nolan was completely defeated and placed in a prison whilst Alan and Oliver headed towards Earth to spread the Scourge virus once and for all. When they arrive to pitch their plan to Mark, he reacts just like his father, completely enraged at the mere thought of risking humanity to kill the Viltrumites. It's a moment that's almost a perfect parallel to Mark's fight with Nolan once again, as Alan begs him to understand that not protecting Earth is for the greater good, and that this sacrifice will save millions of other lives across the universe. However, with both Alan and Oliver fighting together, Mark has no chance. In spite of this, it's surprisingly Thrag who comes in to his rescue. The Viltrum Emperor offers a truce and hits Alan with a whole psychoanalysis on how he doesn't really want to do this, but feels like as a new leader he needs to step out of Theodos's shadow. He tells Alan that he's acting on perceived sense of duty rather than a good sense of judgment, and warns him against making a decision that he knows he will regret. For his part, Alan actually takes everything Thrag says into consideration, and begrudgingly agrees that he may have been hasty. However, things go completely off the rails when Robot and a group of heroes arrive to arrest Mark for opposing Earth's new robot overlord. In the chaos, Oliver manages to steal the Scourge virus from Alan and dives towards Earth in order to release it. Mark desperately tries to stop his brother, but during the heated battle, he is sprayed by the Scourge virus. Seeing that the two of them may have just killed the man who helped them achieve so much, a dear friend and brother, Alan and Oliver realize how foolish they were to resort to genocide. Mark is given to the Viltrumites to try and heal him, whilst Alan grabs Dinosaurus to help them on their research before being ordered to leave by Thrag. He and Oliver begin questioning how far they were willing to go in the pursuit of eliminating the Viltrumites and how much they regret their decision. Well, Alan questioned those things. Oliver only really cares that Mark was in danger. Outside of that, he wasn't concerned with Earth at all. Well, and a bit frightening. Eventually, Mark makes a full recovery, where Alan makes amends before going back to Talescrian with Oliver. Upon arriving, he immediately releases Nolan and asks for his forgiveness, explaining that he was under a lot of pressure and almost made the mistake of a lifetime. As Nolan understands what it means to make a big mistake when under pressure, he forgives Alan. They make up and Nolan heads to Earth on a mission to keep tabs on the Viltrumites, who are now living there on Alan's behalf. This goes well? The next time Alan hears from Nolan, the good news is that he's been made into the Emperor of the Viltrumites. However, Alan is less excited about the news that Nolan released Thrag to be a free man sent into exile. Whilst Nolan is comfortable enough to allow such a threat to live, Alan has other ideas. Thus, he sends Battle Beast to find and assassinate the former Emperor of Viltrum. Meanwhile, on Earth, Robot kinda continues his domination of the planet, whilst Mark, Eve, and their daughter Terra leave in disgust, opting to come and live on Talescrian with Alan and Oliver. Mark picks up a job as a coalition spy, but doesn't want to be sent on any truly dangerous missions because he doesn't want to risk being hurt now that he has his own child. Alan agrees. They shake hands, and almost immediately he tells Mark that he's afraid Battle Beast will fail to kill Thrag, and says that Mark will need to go and investigate a few planets that Thrag could be on, aka the most dangerous mission he possibly could have been sent on. Whilst on this mission, Mark just, casually reboots the entire universe ever so slightly, but sets things back to normal and returns after 5 years. Yeah, I know, listen, it's a very long story, okay? Let us know in the comments if it's something you think we should cover on the channel. When Mark finally returns, Alan is overjoyed to see him. However, the news isn't all good. Over the last 5 years, the battle with Thrag has continued, but things are not going well. Alan, of course, needs to ask Mark if he is totally retired, to which Mark tells him that he is never coming back after losing so much time with his family. Alan clearly wants Mark to help and understands the risk to the universe involved with him not helping, but he also understands his decision and apologizes for bringing up Thrag and being insensitive, again saying that he's just under a lot of pressure. And it makes sense why he feels this way. Soon after, he's getting down with Telia, which, side note, you see what that looks like, and Yeah, that's a bit weird. But either way, he receives a call demanding he heads to the council because of an emergency. When he arrives, a representative named Elliot is trying to lead a coup against him, and a small group ambushes Alan. They must not have gotten the message about Alan being one of the strongest people alive though, and he easily overpowers them. As a last resort, Elliot sets off a bomb that blows up the Coalition headquarters and leaves Alan as a charred husk with both arms and legs blown off. As we've seen with Alan though, the dude just lives through just about anything, and he assures everyone else that it isn't as bad as it looks. This seems like a joke at first, but no, seriously, after just a couple days he's more or less recovered. Now whilst Mark is out to fight with Thrag, Oliver is definitely not. He's working as a Coalition double agent under Alan's orders, where he's keeping an eye on Thrag as he spreads his army by creating Oliver-like bug babies on Thraxa. But to keep his cover, Oliver is forced to tell Thrag where Mark and Eve are living. This leads to Thrag and two of his bug children launching a surprise attack that leads to Mark, Eve and Oliver all being killed. Luckily, Eve is able to save herself and Mark with her powers, but unfortunately Oliver isn't able to be brought back to life. At the funeral, Mark blames Alan for his brother's death and attacks him. Alan tells him that Oliver volunteered for that job, and he even tried to talk him out of it, but also adds that he wasn't really in a position to turn down help against Thrag. Mark very fairly pushes back against this, but ultimately Eve steps in to stop the fight, with Alan noting that he isn't upset at Mark for attacking him, but understands why he's so upset. Following this, a very melancholy Alan talks to Talia about how Oliver's death will be a catalyst that leads Mark and Eve to want to kill Thrag, how Mark's involvement will bring Nolan and the other Viltrumites into the picture, and how the end is now in sight. However, as he thinks about how he pushed Oliver into a situation that killed him and how he knew all of this was going to happen, he starts crying. In the 5 years since we'd last seen him, he'd been broken and once again made a decision that the ends justified the means. But this time, rather than sacrificing an entire planet, he chose to sacrifice a friend. Something we talked about in our video on Nolan was how accountability and willingness to grow were core themes of his character. However, this is a point where he and Alan are very much different. Whilst Alan is able to see the good in people, he struggles to actually believe they can change if he doesn't see it with his own eye, and that largely stems from himself not being able to change. Alan goes through as much as anyone else in the story, but he never really grows or develops, and that is seen clearly in issue 134, where he returns to Mark and admits to betraying him and says that Oliver's death was his fault. However, again, he blames it on the pressure that he was under. Whereas Nolan might make poor choices under pressure, he will not make the same mistake twice, and he certainly won't make the same excuse twice. But for 5 years now, Alan has blamed every slip-up, mistake and accidental genocide attempt on the stress associated with being a leader. No, it's never his fault. He's just a victim of circumstance, and it's only after he deals with the consequences that he begins to reflect on the other options he had. Alan continues here that the Coalition is falling apart, and if Thrag isn't killed soon, the whole system will fall into anarchy. Whilst apologising, he is justifying his sacrifice of Mark's brother to him, and while it looks like Mark is about to deck him, it's Eve who does the right thing and slams him into the ground. Mark tells her to let him go, saying that Alan put the lives of the people before the lives of his loved ones, something that should be the way things go, but something Mark himself has never been able to do. He recognises that yeah, it was a pretty dick move, and he will probably never forgive him for it. But at the very least, he understands. With Mark's help, Alan manages to recruit Nolan and the Viltrumites, and with that, it's time for the final showdown. A battle starts between the Coalition and Thrag's forces, and we come face to face with the hundreds, if not thousands of children he has created his army with. After a brutal day of slaughter, the Coalition feigns a retreat and leads Thrag to Earth for the last push. All of Earth's Viltrumites are waiting near the sun to sit in a blind spot, and as Thrag and his army approach, they are ambushed. Mark manages to push Thrag into the sun, and Thrag's daughter Ursal calls for their army to stop fighting. She sees how the coalition members protect, fight for, and cry for each other, and realizes that her father was nothing like that. She tells her siblings that their father doesn't care about them, and so they shouldn't die for his sake any longer. Mark and Thrag continue to burn apart in the sun, but Alan dives in to pull Mark out at the very last second, and the battle finally comes to an end. Alan meets with Ursal after the fight and has her released from her handcuffs. He tells her that because she stopped the violence and showed that she was willing to prevent casualties, he believed she had good in her. She's hesitant to believe him, but tells her all about this foreign concept of forgiveness. Once things have settled down, and once Mark has become the new emperor of Viltrum after his father passed away, Alan meets with him one more time. Mark says Alan is a better leader than a friend, and that's okay, because that's just where they are in their lives. They can still work together as leaders, but they're not exactly going to grab burgers together anytime soon. Maybe, as leaders, they could use code ABD on gamer subs. Centuries later, as Mark continues to lead Viltrum on a peacekeeping mission across the universe, Alan would call him over to talk. He tells Mark that he's so effective in bringing peace across the universe that he's causing planets to leave the coalition because they don't feel like it needs to exist anymore. Mark, of course, pushes back, saying that maybe it doesn't. This whole time, Alan had been all about anything for peace, but now that the coalition wasn't needed, the peace part isn't important. And so, he goes to war with Mark and the Viltrumites? Now, of course, the coalition is completely dominated, but at the end, Mark helps his former friend up from the rubble. Alan asks if Mark is going to change everything, to which he replies that if it makes a better world, then yes, he will. Then dumping a load of facts on Alan about the flaws of the coalition and planets like Talescrian that claim prosperity and instead drain resources from several worlds, whilst forcing their populaces onto one cramped and shared one. Ultimately, Alan is a character who even centuries into the future refuses to change. And just like the coalition and the old ways of Viltrum, he falls to the side as a relic of the past as a result. Now, if you enjoyed this video, then you'll enjoy this one on your screen right now, detailing the full story of Nolan Grayson, aka Omniman.